The 20th of May, 1945, dawned gray and drizzling over the English Channel as the transport ship HMS Duchess of Richmond cut through choppy waters toward Liverpool. Below deck, 217 German prisoners of war sat in cramped silence, their field-gray uniforms stained with the mud of defeat. Among them was Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann, a 23-year-old former machine gunner from Hamburg whose hands still trembled from weeks of combat in the Ruhr Valley. He pressed his forehead against the cold metal hull and tried not to think about what horrors awaited them on British soil. The propaganda had been relentless throughout the war years. Goebbels' radio broadcasts had painted Britain as a nation of brutal captors who tortured prisoners, starved them in fetid camps, and worked them to death in coal mines. Klaus had heard the stories from older soldiers' tales of the Great War, of British camps where German posts allegedly died by the thousands. Now, as the engines churned and the vessel rolled, he wondered if he would survive to see his mother again. When the ship finally docked at Liverpool's Prince's Landing stage that afternoon, Klaus and his fellow prisoners were herded up onto the deck. What struck him first was not brutality but bureaucracy. British soldiers in perfectly pressed uniforms stood in orderly lines, clipboards in hand, their faces showing neither hatred nor cruelty, merely the tired efficiency of men processing yet another shipment of defeated enemies. An officer with a neat mustache called out names in heavily accented German, checking them against his lists. The prisoners were marched down the gangplank in columns of 4. Klaus expected jeering crowds, perhaps thrown stones or spat curses. Instead, the Liverpool dockworkers barely glanced up from their tasks. A few women in headscarves paused to watch, their expressions more curious than hostile. One elderly man in a flat cap actually nodded at them, as if acknowledging their shared humanity despite the uniform they wore. They were loaded onto lorries with canvas covers and driven through the city streets. Klaus peered through gaps in the fabric, catching glimpses of a world that contradicted everything he had been told. Yes, Liverpool bore the scars of German bombing, entire blocks reduced to rubble, churches with their spires collapsed. But between the destruction stood intact shops with goods in their windows, children playing football in cleared lots, women queuing at a greengrocer's with ration books in hand. This was not a starving, desperate nation on the brink of collapse. This was a country that had endured and somehow maintained its ordinary rhythms of life. According to records preserved in the National Archives Q documentation that historians would later examine in detail, over 400,000 German posts passed through British reception camps between 1944 and 1948. The lorry carrying Klaus and his companions drove north for nearly 2 hours before turning down a country lane lined with hedgerows bursting with May blossoms. When they finally stopped and the canvas was pulled back, Klaus stepped down onto gravel and stared in complete disbelief at what lay before him. The camp that stretched before Klaus Zimmermann's astonished eyes bore no resemblance to the nightmare compounds of Nazi propaganda. Neat rows of wooden huts stood on carefully maintained grounds, their fresh paint gleaming in the weak afternoon sunlight. A proper perimeter fence enclosed the facility, certainly, but it was nothing like the electrified death traps he had imagined. Beyond the wire, the Cheshire countryside rolled away in gentle green hills dotted with sheep. Church bells rang from a nearby village, their sound carrying on the damp air like a reminder of peacetime normality. British guards directed the new arrivals toward a large building marked Reception and Processing. Inside, the contrast with their expectations became even more pronounced. Medical officers conducted thorough examinations, checking for wounds, infections, and signs of malnutrition. A young British doctor named Captain Edward Thornton examined Klaus's badly healed shoulder injury from shrapnel and immediately arranged for proper treatment. "We'll have our surgeon look at this tomorrow," Thornton said in passable German. "Should have been set properly weeks ago." Klaus exchanged bewildered glances with Gefreiter Otto Becker, a Berliner who had fought beside him through the final chaotic retreat. Both men had been prepared for interrogations, perhaps beatings, certainly deprivation. Instead, they were issued clean blankets, provided with soap and towels, and directed to washing facilities where hot water actually ran from the taps. The contrast was so jarring that some prisoners suspected it was an elaborate ruse designed to lower their guard before the real horrors began. The first meal served in the camp dining hall that evening became a topic of intense discussion among the Germans for days afterward. They filed in expecting watery soup and stale bread if they were fed at all. What they received was a hot dinner of mutton stew, boiled potatoes, carrots, and bread with margarine. The portions were hardly generous by pre-war standards, but they were substantial and the food was properly cooked. A British sergeant major overseeing the meal distribution noticed the prisoners' shocked expressions and allowed himself a small smile. "You're under the protection of His Majesty's government now," he announced in German. "You'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention." After the meal, the camp commandant, Lieutenant Colonel James Ashford Price, addressed the assembled prisoners in the parade ground. He was a lean man in his 40s with the weathered face of someone who had seen considerable combat. According to contemporary accounts found in military records, Ashford Price had fought in North Africa and Normandy before being assigned to POW administration. He spoke clearly and without emotion, outlining the camp rules and expectations. "You are prisoners of war, not criminals," Ashford Price stated firmly. "You will be required to work, as specified under international law. You will receive pay for your labor. You will be permitted to write letters home once your identity is confirmed. You will be treated fairly so long as you cause no trouble. Britain is a nation of laws, gentlemen, and those laws apply even to our enemies." Klaus listened with growing confusion. This was not the Britain described in Wehrmacht briefings. Where was the vengeance they had been promised would be unleashed upon them? Where were the barbaric guards and starvation rations? That night, lying on an actual cot with a mattress thin but serviceable, Klaus stared at the ceiling of the hut and tried to reconcile his expectations with reality. Around him, dozens of other prisoners whispered in the darkness, sharing their own observations and theories. The 21st of May brought revelations that deepened the prisoners' confusion about their captors' intentions. After morning roll call, Klaus and 24 other men were selected for work detail and transported by lorry to a nearby farm. They arrived expecting backbreaking labor under harsh supervision, but what they encountered was an elderly farmer named George Whitmore, who treated them more like hired hands than enemy soldiers. Whitmore was a stocky man in his 60s with soil permanently embedded under his fingernails and a practical approach to the war's aftermath. His 2 sons were serving overseas, one with the 8th Army in Italy, another with the occupation forces in Germany, and he desperately needed help bringing in the spring planting. "Right then," he said, assessing the group of Germans with the same critical eye he might use on livestock. "Who among you knows anything about farming?" 3 prisoners raised their hands, including Klaus, who had spent childhood summers on his uncle's farm outside Hamburg. Whitmore nodded approvingly and set them to work preparing fields for potato planting. A young British corporal named Davies stood guard, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder, but he spent most of his time reading a newspaper propped against a fence post. The prisoners worked steadily, grateful for the physical activity after weeks of captivity and transport. Around mid-morning, Whitmore's wife Margaret appeared with a cart containing a massive teapot, cups, and a plate of biscuits. Klaus froze, convinced this was some kind of test. But Mrs. Whitmore simply poured tea and handed it around, offering the biscuits with matter-of-fact hospitality. "You'll work better with something warm inside you," she said. The tea was weak rationing affected everyone, clearly, but it was hot and sweet, and the gesture was utterly bewildering to men who had been told the British would treat them as subhuman. During the break, George Whitmore sat on his cart and lit his pipe, studying the prisoners thoughtfully. "I suppose you lot think we're going to work you to death, eh?" he said through Klaus, who was emerging as the group's informal translator due to his schoolboy English. "Well, we're not. You'll do a fair day's work for fair treatment. My sons are in your country right now, possibly dealing with German prisoners. I have to trust they're being treated decently, so I'll treat you decently. That's how civilization works, isn't it?" This philosophy, simple, pragmatic, rooted in a kind of reciprocal humanity, seemed to define the British approach to their captives. By lunchtime, the prisoners were eating sandwiches of cheese and pickle alongside Corporal Davies, who entertained them with a comedic account of his disastrous attempts to learn German from a phrase book. The language barrier created humorous misunderstandings, and Klaus found himself laughing for the first time in months. The work continued into the afternoon, and Klaus noticed something remarkable about the British countryside around him. Despite years of war, despite rationing and hardship, there was an orderliness to everything. Hedgerows were maintained, stone walls repaired, fields carefully tended. This was a society that had absorbed terrible blows, the Blitz, the Beau Campaign, countless casualties overseas, yet had maintained its fundamental structures and decencies. The propaganda image of Britain as a nation on the verge of starvation and chaos was demonstrably false. The 22nd of May marked Klaus Zimmermann's third day in British captivity, and it brought his most surprising encounter yet. The work detail returned to Whitmore's farm, but this time they were joined by a visitor who would fundamentally challenge Klaus's understanding of his enemy. Dr. Henry Blackwood was a retired physician from the nearby village of Knutsford, a scholarly man in his 70s who had volunteered to provide additional medical services to the POW camp. Blackwood had served as a medical officer during the First World War and had spent time in German field hospitals during prisoner exchanges. He spoke fluent German, having studied in Heidelberg before the Great War, and he approached the prisoners with a combination of professional concern and genuine curiosity. During the midday break, he examined Klaus's shoulder properly, tutting disapprovingly at the poor initial treatment. "Battlefield surgery," he murmured, "necessary but crude. We'll have you properly sorted out." What struck Klaus most forcefully was Blackwood's willingness to engage in actual conversation. The doctor asked about Klaus's hometown, his family, his education. When Klaus mentioned he had hoped to study engineering before the war, Blackwood's eyes lit up. "Ah, Hamburg's Technical Institute has an excellent reputation. My colleague Professor Schneider taught there before all this madness. Do you know if the institute survived the bombing?" The question was asked with genuine concern, not as interrogation or psychological manipulation. Klaus found himself explaining that much of Hamburg had been destroyed in the firestorm of 1943, including several university buildings. Blackwood shook his head sadly. Such waste. Such terrible, senseless waste. All that knowledge, all those young minds, all that potential squandered by madmen on both sides. This was the first time Klaus had heard a British person express anything other than triumphalism about Germany's destruction. The complexity of Blackwood's position, victorious yet sorrowful, proud of his country's resistance yet mourning the broader catastrophe, revealed a sophisticated moral landscape that Klaus had not expected to encounter. According to historical research documented in accounts like The Captive Heart, Britain and Its Prisoners of War, many British citizens approached German posts with this same complicated mixture of victory and regret, seeing in the defeated soldiers not monsters but fellow human beings caught in history's machinery. That afternoon, while planting potatoes in neat rows, Klaus worked alongside a young prisoner named Hermann Vogel from Stuttgart. Hermann was only 19, drafted in the war's final desperate months, and he seemed completely overwhelmed by the disconnect between Nazi propaganda and British reality. "They told us the British would starve us," he whispered. "They told us we would be worked to death in mines. My sergeant said they would shoot prisoners who could not work. But they give us tea and biscuits, Klaus, tea and biscuits." Klaus understood Hermann's confusion because he felt it himself. Every day brought small revelations that undermined the worldview they had been force-fed for years. The British guards who treated them firmly but without cruelty. The farmers who spoke to them as workers rather than slaves. The village children who sometimes gathered at the farm's edge, staring with curiosity rather than hatred. The local vicar who had arrived at the camp on Sunday to offer religious services to German prisoners in their own language, without any expectation of conversion or propaganda. The systematic decency was almost harder to process than cruelty would have been. Cruelty they could have understood. It would have confirmed everything they had been told. But this patient, bureaucratic fairness challenged their entire understanding of the war and their place in it. The 28th of May brought an encounter that would remain fixed in Klaus Zimmermann's memory for the rest of his life. A new work detail took him and 15 other prisoners to help with repairs at a rural school near the village of Holmes Chapel. The building had suffered minor damage when a German bomber, possibly damaged and trying to jettison its load, had dropped several bombs across the countryside in 1941. One explosion had damaged the school's roof and several windows, and repairs had been delayed by wartime material shortages. The headmistress, Miss Eleanor Hartley, was a formidable woman in her 50s who had taught at the school for nearly 30 years. She met the German prisoners with cool professionalism, showing them the damaged sections and explaining exactly what needed to be done. A British corporal named Willis supervised, but Miss Hartley clearly ran the operation with the same firm authority she applied to her students. During the morning break, as the prisoners sat outside with their tea, a group of schoolchildren emerged for their recess. The children ranged in age from perhaps 5 to 11, and they naturally gravitated toward the fence that separated the work area from the playground. They stared at the German prisoners with undisguised fascination, whispering among themselves. Klaus felt profoundly uncomfortable under their scrutiny, acutely aware that these children's fathers and brothers had fought and died against men like him. One small girl, no more than 7 years old, approached the fence directly. She had ginger hair tied in plaits and a gap-toothed smile. "Are you really Germans?" she asked in a clear, piping voice. Klaus nodded carefully. "My dad's in Germany," she continued matter-of-factly. "He's a sergeant in the army. He sends me letters. Are you bad men?" Before Klaus could formulate an answer to this devastating question, Miss Hartley appeared and placed a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. "That's quite enough, Mary. Back to your games now." But then, to Klaus's surprise, the headmistress addressed the prisoners directly in clear, slow English that she seemed confident they would understand at least partially. "These men are prisoners of war," she told the assembled children, her voice carrying the same pedagogical tone she might use for a geography lesson. "They fought for their country, just as our soldiers fight for ours. The war is over now, and they are being treated according to the rules of civilized nations. They are working to help repair the damage done during the war, and you will treat them with basic courtesy, just as you would any visitors to our community." This measured explanation, neither demonizing nor excusing, struck Klaus as remarkably sophisticated for young children. But Miss Hartley was not finished. She turned to Klaus and the other prisoners, switching to heavily accented but competent German. "You will conduct yourselves with dignity while working on school property. These children have lost fathers and brothers in this war. They have endured bombing and deprivation. You will respect their sacrifice and their innocence. Is that understood?" Klaus and the others nodded solemnly. The work continued through the day, and Klaus found himself profoundly moved by the normality of it all. Children played, learned their lessons, sang songs during music hour. Their voices drifted through the broken windows simple melodies about springtime and flowers. These were not the children of monsters or fanatics. They were simply children, growing up in a country that had endured tremendous suffering but had somehow maintained its fundamental decency and structure. That evening, back at the camp, Klaus lay on his cot and composed a letter to his mother in Hamburg. The censors would read it before it was sent, he knew, but he wrote honestly about what he had seen. Not the physical conditions of captivity, those could wait, but the strange and unexpected humanity of his captors. The 5th of June, 1945, brought a change in the camp's atmosphere that Klaus had not anticipated. News had filtered through that Winston Churchill's coalition government had fallen and Britain would hold general elections in July. The prisoners discussed this development with confusion. How could a victorious nation replace its leadership immediately after winning history's greatest war? The British Guards, when asked, simply shrugged and explained that this was how democracy worked. "Churchill won the war, but that doesn't mean he'll win the peace," Corporal Davies explained during one work detail. "People want to vote on what comes next. Housing, jobs, the health service, all that matters now more than military glory. This casual acceptance of political change, the orderly transfer of debate from battlefield to ballot box, represented a kind of stability that seemed alien to men raised under dictatorship." That same day, Klaus and several other prisoners were assigned to a different kind of labor, helping to clear rubble in a bombed section of Manchester. The lorry ride into the city provided a sobering view of German bombing's impact. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ruins, churches stood as hollow shells, and gaps in terraced housing blocks revealed where bombs had torn through civilian lives. Yet even here, amidst the destruction, the British had responded with characteristic organization. Rubble was being systematically cleared, salvageable bricks cleaned and stacked for reuse, and temporary housing erected where permanent structures once stood. The work crew was supervised by a man named Albert Thornton, a foreman with the city's reconstruction department. Thornton was a Mancunian through and through, his accent so thick that Klaus struggled to understand him even with his schoolboy English. Thornton had lost his eldest son at Dunkirk and his home to a German bomb in 1940. Yet he treated the German work party with gruff fairness. "Right, you lot," Thornton announced. "We're clearing this street today. Bricks in one pile, twisted metal in another, everything else in the third. Work steady, work safe, and we'll get along just fine." He paused, studying the Germans with sharp eyes. "I'll not pretend I'm happy about what your lot did to my city, but the war's done and we've got to rebuild. So let's get on with it." The physical labor was hard but not cruel, and Klaus found a strange satisfaction in it. Each brick cleared, each piece of rubble removed, was a small act of restoration, a tiny contribution toward undoing some of the damage he had been part of causing. During breaks, local women operated a mobile canteen, providing tea and occasionally buns to the workers. Some served the Germans with tight-lipped disapproval, but others were surprisingly friendly, asking questions about Germany and expressing hope that the prisoners' families were safe. One woman, Mrs. Patricia Hughes, had a son who was part of the British occupation forces in Germany. She approached Klaus during the afternoon break, her face anxious. "You're from Hamburg?" one of the lads said. Klaus nodded. "My son Thomas is stationed near there. Is it very bad, the destruction, I mean?" Klaus considered lying, softening the truth, but something in her worried eyes demanded honesty. "Yes, ma'am. Very bad. The firestorm in 1943 destroyed much of the city. But people endure. They find ways to continue." Mrs. Hughes nodded slowly, tears glimmering. "I pray he stays safe. And I pray your family is safe too. Mothers shouldn't have to suffer for what governments do." This exchange, witnessed by several other prisoners, further deepened Klaus's internal conflict. The enemy was supposed to be monolithic, hateful, barbaric. But these British civilians, despite legitimate grievances and genuine suffering, insisted on maintaining their humanity and extending it even to those who had bombed their cities. The 15th of June marked a significant development that would reshape Klaus Zimmermann's understanding of British society. The camp commandant announced that selected prisoners with agricultural or construction skills would be moved to a new system of working camps, smaller facilities closer to farms and work sites where labor was desperately needed. Klaus and Otto Becker were both selected, along with 30 other prisoners deemed reliable and cooperative. The new camp was located near a cluster of farms in rural Cheshire, housed in converted farm buildings that had previously stored equipment. The facility was smaller, the security lighter, and the atmosphere notably different from the larger camp. British guards were present but less visible, and the prisoners were treated more as laborers than captives. They received their own ration books, wages in camp script that could be used at a small canteen, and even permission to write more frequent letters home. Klaus was assigned to work regularly at George Whitmore's farm, which meant daily contact with the old farmer and his wife. Over the following weeks, a cautious friendship developed. Whitmore shared stories of his time in the Great War he had fought at the Somme and bore the emotional scars quietly. He showed Klaus photographs of his sons in uniform, expressing worry about their safety with the same anxiety Klaus's mother surely felt about him. "War's a terrible thing," Whitmore said one afternoon as they repaired a stone wall together. "Makes enemies of men who might otherwise be friends. My father fought the Germans in the last war, and here I am working alongside a German now. Strange how history circles round." He packed his pipe thoughtfully. "You seem a decent enough lad. How'd you end up in Hitler's army?" Klaus explained haltingly about conscription, about having no real choice, about the gradual realization that the war was wrong, but the impossibility of resistance. Whitmore listened without judgment, nodding slowly. That's the trap, isn't it? Good men caught in bad systems. My boy Thomas, he's a gentle soul really, wanted to be a teacher. But the war came, and off he went. You do what you must when history demands it. This philosophical acceptance, the recognition that individual Germans might be decent people trapped in a criminal system, was apparently widespread in rural Britain. Klaus encountered it repeatedly in the villages around the working camp. Some locals remained hostile, certainly. A pub keeper in Cootsford refused to serve the German workers even when they came with British guards. But others extended surprising kindness. The village baker, Mr. Henry Cooper, sometimes sold day-old bread to the German work parties at reduced prices, explaining that waste was sinful and hunger was hunger regardless of nationality. The local librarian, Miss Adelaide Pembroke, allowed prisoners to borrow books, carefully selected volumes of English literature and history that she thought might educate them about British culture. Perhaps understanding will prevent the next war, she said hopefully, stamping cards for Klaus's selection of Dickens and Hardy novels. Research preserved in archives such as those examined by scholars like Richard Garrett in his work on POW experiences confirms these patterns. Many rural communities, desperate for labor and less affected by wartime propaganda than urban centers, developed surprisingly cordial relationships with German prisoners. The social boundaries remained clear. Prisoners were not equals, but basic humanity was extended more often than denied. The 26th of July, 1945, brought news that sent shockwaves through both British society and the prisoner of war camps. The general election results were announced, and against all expectations, Churchill's Conservatives had been defeated by Clement Attlee's Labour Party in a landslide victory. The British people, having endured so much to achieve victory, had immediately voted for dramatic social change rather than rewarding their wartime leader. Klaus watched the British Guards discuss this outcome with a mixture of surprise and acceptance. Some were pleased, others disappointed, but none suggested the election was illegitimate or that the result should be overturned. The peaceful transfer of power, even after the most momentous victory in British history, demonstrated a political maturity that seemed almost incomprehensible to men who had lived under Nazi rule. "That's democracy for you," Corporal Davies said with a philosophical shrug. "Churchill won the war, but people want houses and jobs and proper health care now. Can't say I blame them. This casual acceptance of electoral defeat by a beloved leader would have been unthinkable in Germany, where political transitions required either death or catastrophic military collapse." That same day, Klaus received his first letter from home since his capture. The censors had cleared it, and his hand shook as he opened the thin envelope. His mother's handwriting was shaky but legible. She was alive, living in the partially destroyed family home with Klaus's younger sister Emma. They had survived the firestorm and the subsequent devastation, enduring near-starvation conditions in Hamburg's ruins. But they were alive, and his mother's relief that he had survived and was being treated well was palpable in every carefully chosen word. The letter transformed Klaus's mental state. Knowing his family had survived allowed him to think beyond mere daily existence and consider his future. Britain's intentions toward prisoners were becoming clearer. The war crimes trials were beginning. The major Nuremberg proceedings would start in November, but ordinary soldiers who had not committed specific atrocities were apparently not destined for punishment beyond captivity itself. During this period, Klaus's work at Whitmore's farm continued, and he developed genuine skill in agricultural labor. The physical work was demanding but satisfying, and Whitmore proved to be a patient teacher. The old farmer explained crop rotation, animal husbandry, soil management, practical knowledge delivered without condescension. Margaret Whitmore sometimes invited the German workers into the farmhouse kitchen for lunch, serving simple meals of soup and bread while treating them like any hired men rather than enemies. One afternoon, Whitmore's younger son, David, returned home on leave from his service in Germany. The meeting was awkward initially. David in British uniform, Klaus in his prisoner's clothes, both young men shaped by the same terrible conflict. But David shared his father's pragmatic temperament. Over tea, he described the devastation in Germany with genuine sorrow rather than triumph. It's heartbreaking, really, David said. Cities just gone, people living in cellars, children starving in the streets. We're supposed to be the victors, but there's no joy in it when you see what's been done. He looked at Klaus directly. Your family, are they in Hamburg? Klaus nodded. I'm sorry. I've seen what Hamburg looks like now. It must be hell for anyone trying to survive there. This empathy from a British soldier who had every reason to celebrate Germany's destruction moved Klaus deeply. It suggested that the humanity he had witnessed in Britain was not merely policy, but genuine cultural characteristic, a refusal to dehumanize enemies even in victory. The 28th of August, 1945, marked 3 months since Klaus Zimmermann first set foot on British soil, and it brought an experience that would fundamentally reshape his understanding of what Britain had fought to preserve. George Whitmore invited Klaus and Otto Becker to attend the local village fete, an annual summer celebration that had been suspended during the war years and was now being revived as a symbol of peace's return. The British authorities granted unusual permission for the prisoners to attend under supervision, apparently viewing the event as both reward for good behavior and opportunity for community integration. Klaus approached the fete with apprehension, expecting hostility or at least uncomfortable stares. What he encountered instead was a glimpse into the social fabric that Britain had struggled so desperately to defend. The village green was transformed with bunting, stalls, games, and a small bandstand where local musicians performed. Children ran freely, playing traditional games. Women sold homemade jam and baked goods, the ingredients carefully assembled from ration supplies. Men competed in comic races and demonstrated agricultural techniques. It was profoundly, deliberately normal an assertion that ordinary life could and would continue despite everything the war had done to threaten it. Klaus and Otto, clearly marked by their uniforms, drew curious glances but surprisingly little hostility. Some villagers avoided them, certainly, and Klaus caught hostile whispers, but others approached with tentative friendliness. The vicar, who had conducted German language services at the camp, greeted them warmly and introduced them to his wife. Margaret Whitmore brought them plates of sandwiches and cake, treating them as guests rather than prisoners. Several farmers who employed POW labor stopped to chat, asking about their work and commenting on the weather with the universal small talk of agricultural communities. The most remarkable moment came when the band began playing, and elderly couples took to the green for traditional dancing. Klaus watched with fascination as 3 generations participated, grandparents teaching grandchildren the old steps, middle-aged couples moving with practiced ease, teenagers attempting the dances with varying degrees of success. This was cultural continuity made visible, tradition preserved and transmitted despite 6 years of existential threat. George Whitmore, observing Klaus's fascination, leaned close and spoke quietly. This is what we were fighting for, lad. Not glory or conquest or revenge. Just this, the right to have our village fete, to dance our traditional dances, to raise our children in peace and pass on what matters to us. Hitler wanted to end all this, to impose his vision of how the world should be. But we refused. This, he gestured at the scene, this is British defiance. Not with guns and bombs, though we had those when needed, but with jam-making and Morris dancing and church bells on Sunday morning. As the afternoon faded into evening and the prisoners were transported back to camp, Klaus carried with him a profound revelation. Britain had not defeated Germany through superior brutality or totalitarian efficiency. It had won by maintaining exactly those civilized values and ordinary traditions that the Nazis had mocked as weakness. The tea breaks during work, the Geneva Convention protocols, the village fetes and democratic elections, these were not signs of softness but of strength. A society confident enough in its values to extend them even to enemies was a society that could endure almost anything. In the months and years that followed, Klaus Zimmermann would remain in Britain, contributing his labor to reconstruction until his eventual repatriation in 1948. He would return to Hamburg, help rebuild his shattered city, eventually study engineering as he had once hoped and marry and raise children. But he would never forget those early days in British captivity, when everything he had been told about his enemies proved false. The shock of that first day, the unexpected decency, The bureaucratic fairness, the tea and biscuits, became the foundation for a different understanding. Klaus had expected to find monsters and instead found human beings, flawed and occasionally hostile, certainly, but fundamentally committed to maintaining civilization even in victory. It was a lesson about what nations fight for and how they reveal their true character not in triumph celebration but in how they treat the defeated. The German prisoners who passed through Britain during those years carried home more than memories of agricultural work and rationed meals. They carried knowledge that democracy could function, that rule of law could prevail, that enemies could be treated with justice rather than vengeance. In the ruins of post-war Germany, some of those former prisoners would help build a new society, one that rejected dictatorship and embraced the democratic values they had witnessed in captivity. Klaus was among them, and until his death in 2003, he would tell his grandchildren about the day he arrived in Britain expecting hell and found humanity instead.